My name is Rachel Becker. I'm the Senior Manager of Programs at Cancer and Careers.
And I'm Monica Bryant, the Chief Operating Officer for Triage Cancer.
And Cancer and Careers, for those of you who aren't familiar with the organization, is a national nonprofit. We've been around for 14 years, and we are the only organization in the United States that is solely focused on empowering people with cancer, with other tumor types, to thrive in their working environment. We do this in a number of ways. We have an incredible website that is filled with information, publications which are available in both English and Spanish, many of which you have sitting in front of you right now. We also offer career coaching resources through our website. We hold webinars throughout the year on balancing work and cancer. We archive videos of those as well. And we participate in community events as well as hosting our own events. And in fact, we do have a Midwest conference on work and cancer, which takes place in April of every year. So there'll be one next year as well as a national conference.
And Triage Cancer is also a national nonprofit organization, and we provide information and resources on all types of cancer survivorship issues through hosting a speakers bureau. So if someone was putting on an educational event, they could contact us and we would match them with the speaker. We also have a plethora of free online resources and an educational blog. We do webinars, and on your tables there should be a green handout that details more about our services. And we have experts in numerous fields, but the co-founder and I are both attorneys, and we really focus in on the legal aspects of coping with cancer. So we talk a lot about health insurance issues and finances, estate planning, and of course, employment issues as well. And you may be wondering, it's a little out of the ordinary to have two organizations present like this together, but the reason that we do this presentation together is because we feel very strongly that you can't really talk about the legal issues without also talking about the practical issues. Knowing that a law exists is unhelpful if you don't actually know how to go and talk to your employer about exercising your rights. And so you'll see throughout the presentation that Rachel and I will go back and forth and kind of feed off each other because we think these two things are absolutely intertwined.
Exactly. So these are some of the key topics we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about employment and education rights, including a very important law that you should all be familiar with called the Americans with Disabilities Act that provides for something called reasonable accommodations, which we're going to go into in great detail. We'll also talk a little bit about social media and online brand, as well as the job search.
So before we get into the specifics, we actually wanted to ask you all to help us out a little bit. So just by a show of hands, if you feel comfortable, could you let us know if you're a survivor? Okay, and then how many of you are caregivers? Caregivers. Okay, perfect. And then how many of you in the room are currently working? Okay, versus how many of you are currently or thinking about looking for work? Okay, great. And then lastly, how many of you are in school currently or thinking about maybe going to school? And that means high school, higher ed, vocational. Okay, perfect. So that actually gives us a lot of useful information so that we can make sure, hopefully, you're getting the information you need out of this presentation. So jumping right in, there are a number of places where you can go to find where your rights might be in the education, in employment arena. So first, as Rachel mentioned, there's the federal law, the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, that provides protection against discrimination and may also provide this additional right called a reasonable accommodation. There's also some state fair employment laws that might be relevant to you as well. There are leave laws, both federal and state, that we're going to talk about. And then also, if you are an employee under a contract, so that could mean a union contract, that could just mean an employment contract, it's going to be critical for you to look at your specific contract to see if you have any additional rights as well. Jumping into the ADA. So the ADA, again, is the federal law that protects against discrimination. And just like all of the laws we're going to talk about, there are a few hurdles that you have to jump in order to be eligible to use the protections. And when we talk about the laws, we really urge you to think about the laws as a tool. So I'm certainly not suggesting that everybody should want to be litigious or should think suing is the way to go for things, but really to think about the law as a tool and as a way to get benefits that you're entitled to. So the first hurdle that you're going to have to jump is to work for a big enough employer, and that's a private employer with 15 or more employees, or a state or local government. If you work for the federal government, you are protected, but instead you're going to be protected under the Rehabilitation Act. Very similar protections, just two different laws. The second hurdle is that you have to be a qualified individual. And the legal definition is that you can perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodations. Practically speaking, that means you're qualified for the job we're talking about. So if you're applying to be a commercial truck driver, you have a commercial driver's license. If you're applying to be a lawyer, you've passed the bar in your state. And then finally, you have a disability under the ADA's definition. A lot of times I hear from folks, we travel all over the country giving this presentation, and we hear from people, I have an illness, I don't have a disability, and there's some reaction to the word disability. But I urge you not to get caught up in the label here, because remember, it's just lawmakers in DC writing these laws, and they don't always think about all of the issues that come up with a diagnosis. But under the ADA, the definition of a disability is a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. So a major life activity is going to be something that anyone in the average population can do with little or no difficulty. So we're talking about things like walking, talking, breathing, the operation of major bodily functions could be a major life activity. And those are just some examples. The list is exhaustive. Now, the physical or mental impairment has to limit that major life activity, but the limitation has to be substantial. So it can't just be every once in a while you have a hard time sleeping, but rather it's every single night you're not getting enough sleep, or every once in a while you're feeling a little nauseous, but rather you can't get through an entire day without vomiting. So it's that substantial limitation. So those are the three hurdles that you have to jump. And once you've determined that you are in fact eligible to use the ADA's protections, there are 4 different ways to use it. So the first is that you currently have a disability. So you're currently going through treatment and you're suffering from extreme fatigue. The second is that you have a history of having a disability. So this might be a situation where you're you're 5 years out of treatment and you're ready to get back into the workforce, but the employer knows that you're a survivor and is treating you differently because of that knowledge. The third way is being regarded as having a disability. And this really isn't about you or your loved one's capabilities at all, but it's more about the employer's perception of your capabilities. So maybe you are actually doing really well, treatment has been difficult, but you're getting through it, and working is the thing that's helping you get through it all, but you've lost all your hair. And because of that bald head, an employer is now treating you differently because of that perception that you have a disability. And then the fourth way is based on your association with a person with a disability. And this is where caregivers can get some protections under the ADA. Now, the ADA applies to all phases of employment, so as long as you meet these requirements, you work for a big enough employer, you're a qualified individual, and you have a disability, you're protected from hiring to promotions to benefits all the way through firings. So what does the ADA actually give you? As I mentioned earlier, all of these people are going to be protected against discrimination. And when we talk about discrimination, most of us automatically go to something negative. But sometimes, especially in the employment arena, the discrimination isn't always malicious. So it could be an employer treating you differently because they don't want to put too much on you, or they want to make sure that you're focusing on treatment and recovery, but you're now getting treated differently than everybody else and you don't want to be. That could be discrimination as well. If you currently have a disability, You are also entitled to something called reasonable accommodations. And I know we've said the word about 10 times already. I promise you by the time we're finished, we will get in detail about reasonable accommodations and how to ask for them. Now, because I recognize that not all of you are in the workspace yet, it's important to know that very similar rights exist in the education arena as well. So there's two different laws that can be useful when we're talking about disability and education, and that's the Individuals with Disabilities in Education, or IDEA, and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. And both of these laws provide additional benefits and resources to individuals who have a disability who are also in school. Now, we've talked about the federal law, which is the ADA. But for a lot of people, the ADA doesn't apply. So maybe they don't work for a big enough employer, or they don't meet the federal definition of disability. Thankfully, every single state has passed a state fair employment law as well. Many are very similar to the ADA, but some provide additional protections as well. And one of the ways that these state laws can be more protective than the federal law is by covering smaller employers. So this chart shows you how many employees an employer needs in order to be covered by the state fair employment law. So if you look in the first column, you'll find Illinois, which means as long as you don't work for yourself in Illinois and discriminate against yourself, you're protected. If you don't see your state listed here, it just means that the state requirement is the same as the federal requirement, meaning that the employer has to have 15 or more employees. Now, one of the most common questions that I think we get asked as we're traveling the country is, do I have to tell my employer I've been diagnosed? And the answer is no, you don't. But you may have to disclose some information about your medical condition if you're trying to access these rights. And so the first is if you're trying to access the ADA's discrimination protections. The rationale for this is if your employer or potential employer doesn't know that you have a disability, how can they be discriminating against you based on the disability? Then the second and third reasons are to ask for reasonable accommodations or medical leave. And the reason here is that the law really tries to balance the needs of the employee and the needs of the employer. So while the employee might be entitled to all of these things, the employer is also entitled to know if, in fact, the employee is entitled. Does that make sense? Sorry, that was some circular logic there. It's a Saturday. Basically, employers are entitled to know if you're eligible for these rights. But again, a diagnosis might not be necessary. Along the employment continuum, employers are entitled to different information. So pre-offer, so if you're thinking about the job search process and we're in the interview setting, potential employers are only really allowed to ask two questions. The first is, can you perform the essential functions of the job? And how would you perform the essential functions of the job? And these two questions really get to, are you a qualified individual for the job? Once an offer has been made, employers are absolutely entitled to ask for disability-related inquiries or medical exams, but only if they ask that of every employee in the same job category. So they can't just look at somebody with a bald head and go, let's ask some additional questions here to make sure we know what we're getting into. That's discrimination. And then finally, once you're employed, employers are only allowed to ask disability-related inquiries or ask for medical exams if it's job-related and consistent with business necessity. So for example, it might be permissible to ask a school bus driver to take an eye exam every year to make sure they're in fact safe, they can drive children safely, or to ask police officers to take a medical exam to make sure they're fit for duty. So it has to be job-related.
So while we're talking about disclosure and just the idea in general of sharing what's going on in your life in terms of your medical history and condition, it's really important to take a few minutes to talk about the online space. And we bring this up in this context not just because we're at a brain tumor conference and so there's this big piece of your story that you might be discussing online, but because in general, we kind of feel like there's not enough dialogue about why it's important to think about the things that you put online and what it says about you to the people who might be looking for you. And specifically when it comes to work, one of the things that we know is that these days, employers are Googling for candidates, and this is in terms of jobs, this is if you're looking for an internship, they want to find out more about the people who are applying. It's also the case that we're seeing more and more articles popping up about college admissions boards Googling the people who are applying to go to school there. So usually this is not done with any sort of bad intention. It's typically the case that somebody has made a good impression on paper somehow, and whoever is doing the searching wants to find out more about that person. Current employers will do this also sometimes. They want to find out more about the people who are working for them. So good intentions aside, it's still possible that they're going to come across information in a search that you might prefer that an employer or a potential school not know about you. So the bottom line here really is that the internet is a public space. Anyone and everyone has access to it, and that means that anyone can come across whatever it is that you're sharing online. And here's why. So social media sites have privacy settings, and I'm putting air quotes around that word because just because they're called privacy settings doesn't mean that your profile's actually private. What you're seeing in front of you right now is an outdated picture, but we keep using it because it's one of our favorites. It was published in the Wall Street Journal in March of 2013, and all the tiny little print in all the tiny little boxes, which it's difficult for you to read, and that's okay, we didn't expect you to read it, that is outlining all of the steps that you would have had to take in March of 2013 in order to make sure that your Facebook profile was 100% protected. So when I look at that, I personally think that there is nobody in the history of ever, including Mark Zuckerberg himself, who has ever had a 100% protected Facebook profile. And what it's also important to know is that by April of 2013, it was probably the case that this slide was already outdated, because these sites update their privacy policies very regularly. The reason being that sites like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter and all of these new things that are cropping up that I can't even keep in touch with they're designed to sell us things. They gather data about us, they find out the things that we're talking about, the things that we're interested in, and they sell that information to advertisers so the advertisers can make more money. Now, there is a good side to this, which is that it's part of the reason that these sites are free. They don't need us to give them money in order for us to use them. However, in order for them to keep making new deals and keep making more money, they need to constantly shift around the rules, the ways that they're handling the information that they're gathering about us. And when we've created a profile, we've clicked a box and we've agreed to go along with whatever changes they might make. So what that really means is that even if you put in all the time necessary to do all the research, read the terms and conditions, take every single step that you'd have to take in order to make sure that you have a totally private profile, it could all change the next day. And it's really, really exhausting to try to keep on top of all of it. So what can you do? Well, simply put, you can think and plan and really create a strategic map of how you're going to be presenting yourself online. And this is sometimes the overall story of how you present in the online space is sometimes called an online footprint or an online brand. So the first thing to do is make decisions about the things that you're going to be sharing online. And you may include people that you trust as part of this conversation to help think through your ideas and bounce things off of them. Certainly, if you've never been in the workforce before, you probably want to have someone in your circle who has been employed, who understands the things that you may or may not want to share in a workplace. But your circle's probably not going to include everyone who's in your social network. I think in particular, some of us who are a little bit older in the room can relate to the idea that you get sometimes friends requests from people who you went to school with and you haven't seen in years and you accept it, right? So the people who are seeing your information may not be people that you're talking to every day. Which means that once you've made these decisions, you might want to let other people know what those decisions are, specifically if they're likely to tag you in a post. Because if there's something that you don't want being shared online and nobody else knows that, they might be going about business as usual and just share something that you wanted to keep private. So we hear about this a lot in terms of somebody's sister being really proud of how they're handling their treatment and posting about it and tagging them in that post. And then it's public. That information is out there, even if the patient themselves didn't actually plan on sharing it. Also a good idea to make some decisions about where you're sharing this information. So there are 2 websites listed there, My Lifeline and Caring Bridge, and I'm sure that some of you, if not all of you in this room, are probably familiar with those. For those of you who aren't, they are a more controlled environment. They're social networking sites that were designed specifically for people to be talking about their medical conditions, their treatments, providing updates to a circle. What's great is that you invite everybody in, so you don't have to bring that person that you went to elementary school with, but you haven't talked to in 15 years into that circle. Also the case that they have a much, much more effective privacy structure. So they're more guarded, and their privacy policies are much easier to follow. In a nutshell, there are 3 levels of privacy. There's a low, medium, and high. The default setting when you create a profile is medium. So take some time to go in, look at the privacy settings, and see what the protections are. And we've actually included a handout in here on maintaining online privacy, which will walk you through the steps that you would have to take in order to make sure your profile is as protected as possible on these sites. Also important to know that these sites can often be linked to your Facebook page, so you want to check and make sure that there's no default thing on that, that you know that the information you're sharing on Caring Bridge is staying there and not going out beyond it. And the idea in general is to just help you to feel in control of your story. Both of the planning and the understanding the privacy policies really help you be in charge of what your footprint and brand is. And part of the reason that that's important is because the internet is forever. When you put something out online, it doesn't go away, and so there's a potential long-term impact that can happen. A few years ago, we worked with a woman who had gone through cancer treatments while she was in her 20s. She had participated in a local Relay for Life and talked to her local newspaper at the time about everything that she'd been through. And she came to us 11 years after the fact because she was looking for work and she had Googled herself, and that article was the first thing that came up in a Google search. And so she was concerned that as she was looking for a job, an employer might find that story and it could impact her chances of getting a job or even an interview. Because the bottom line, again, is that nobody can see into the future, and we don't know where we're going to be. So making clear decisions ahead of time can help you, it can help prevent a situation where you're finding that there's information up there that you kind of wish didn't sit up there. So right about now, some of you are probably thinking about things that you've posted that you wish you hadn't posted. And that is okay. To you, I say, do not panic. It happens to all of us. It is very common to put something up online and then later have that moment of, ah. So the good news is that there are plenty of things that you can do to take control of the story by showing people who you are, telling them what your skills are, what your talents are, what your interests are, the things that you bring to the table that make you you, and in terms of work or school, the things that would make you a valuable employee or student. So social media sites like social media sites like Twitter and LinkedIn and the others that you see listed on this slide rank really high in Google searches. So becoming active on these sites and coming up with posts that talk about your interests, talk about your skill sets, things like that, will be the things that people find when they Google you. It's probably not going to be, people are probably not going to spend hours and hours digging through your social media posts in order to find out every little thing you've ever said online. They're probably just going to spend some time sitting with the things that are towards the top of the list. So if you can control the things at the top of the list, you're going to call their attention to what you want them to know. We also recommend that before you post, you run each of your potential posts through a couple of filter questions. The first one being, would I want a current boss or a potential future employer or future college to know the thing that I am sharing right now? And the second is, how would I feel if this ended up on the front page of the newspaper, on the front page of a news site? And if you're not sure about what you're posting, if you have some questions, you might want to come up with a process where you run it through other people first, maybe a parent or a trusted friend. I have a friend who's constantly texting me with things she's about to post. So the idea is to, just be putting some thought into what it is that you're saying about yourself online. Of course, you can always delete old posts, but you should know that they still exist somewhere. So again, people are probably just going to be looking at what they see immediately when it comes up, but it's still possible that they're going to find something that you deleted somewhere in cyberspace, although it's going to be a little bit harder. And for that reason, it's a good idea for you to, like our friend who did the Relay for Life, Google yourself so that you know what's up there. Best practice is to do this from a browser you don't use all the time, because that way you're going to have the same experience of a stranger Googling you. And once you know what's up there, you can take some steps to think about how you're going to address any questions that might come up about things that you're not crazy about talking about. And we'll spend some time thinking through how you can prepare those answers in a little bit. And then, of course, setting up your own personal web page or blog is a great way to tell people about who you are. It's really easy to do, even if you've never done it before. There are lots of sites that'll walk you through it step by step. So when it comes to the job search, there are many challenges and unknowns to looking for work in this day and age. But what it's important to recognize is that that's true for everybody. It has nothing to do with medical history. It has nothing to do with qualifications as a worker. It has nothing to do with anything personal about that person. It just has to do with the fact that we are living in a world where it's challenging to find work. And the experience of a job search, because of that, is going to carry with it some setbacks, some disappointments, some moments where you're not feeling so great. So it's really useful to spend some time thinking about how you're going to take care of yourself in those moments where you're feeling disappointed. Reaching out to a social worker who is part of your healthcare team can be really, really useful. And also just keeping in mind, reminding yourself that this happens to everybody, this is not something I should take personally, and instead refocusing on the way that you can take different approaches to finding opportunities to get that job that you really, really want. So we include this slide here because we've found that dating is the best metaphor that we can use for explaining the job search process. Both of them are experiences that have stages to them. Those stages build upon each other. And if you think about dating, the way that we behave on a first date is going to be different from the way that we're behaving with somebody who we've been seeing for 6 months. And it's going to be different from the way that it's going to be even different yet when we're looking at a potential marriage proposal, right? The relationship evolves and the way that we present ourselves evolves. So if you go on a first date and you find yourself sitting across the table from somebody who's saying, I can never meet anybody that I like, and then when I do meet somebody that I like, they don't really like me, and it's just so hard, and I'm getting so tired of dating, or if they're telling you every single little detail about the horrible breakup that they went through with their ex, it's going to land in a specific way, right? Usually when we meet people for the first time, we're looking for reasons to like them, and so if they're sitting there and they're talking about all of these negative things, it's going to sit in a certain way. But 6 months later, when we have a relationship with that person, we know that we like them and things are going well. If they bring up that same information, it was so hard for me to find somebody who really liked me that I also liked. Or I want to tell you about this experience that I had with my ex that was so difficult, that's going to land in a different way. Because we know them, we have context for them. So the same is true in a job search. And I don't want to say that there are rules about how to find a job or the way that you can, that are hard and fast, but we do know that there are approaches that work better most of the time when you're looking for work. And so it's a good idea to have a sense of what those are. Now, the first phase is, of course, finding opportunities and landing interviews. And the moral of the story on this slide is that commercial job boards, like CareerBuilder and Monster.com, those are not the best way to find a job. Very few people actually find work in that way. What they are great for is learning about the companies that you might be applying for work with, and also looking at the language that's being used to describe open positions. And here's why. In today's age, a lot of companies use software to scan resumes before they actually make their way in front of a live person. And that software is looking for specific keywords. So somebody who's totally qualified for a position could send in a resume, and their resume never lands in front of a human because the software doesn't find any of the keywords. So looking at job boards, looking at the specific language, and then updating your resume to contain those keywords can give you a stronger chance. We have a list of sample keywords in your packet. You can also find it on our website for download. And I do want to mention as well that there are a few exceptions to the job board rule. The first is the website that you see listed there, which is called FlexJobs. We're partnered with them. We work very closely with them. They're a wonderful organization. All of their postings are for telecommuting positions or flexible work positions, and they do a lot of vetting. They do a lot of very careful vetting to make sure that these are legit opportunities and that you're well served by applying for them. Also, alumni job boards can be very useful, both for finding jobs and for finding internships. People often want to do right by the people who went to the same school that they went to. And if you're an entry-level candidate, targeted job boards with jobs in a specific field can be very useful. But that's specifically if you're entry-level, so something to keep in mind. So what does work is networking. About 85% of people find their jobs through networking, so that's a really, really high percentage. And essentially anyone can be part of your network. So it's important not to think too narrowly about what that might be. It could be people that you see every day. Your friends, your parents' friends, people in your religious community, somebody that you always bump into at the supermarket. It could also be somebody that you met today at this conference. True story. I was at the beach this summer with a friend of mine. He struck up a conversation with people who were sitting next to us because they had a really cool beach umbrella that had like one of those screens that prevents the wind from blowing on you. Wanted to know where he got the umbrella. The two of them started chatting. Well, the next thing you know, my friend's networked his way into a job interview. So you never know where it's going to happen. And a lot of people are gun shy when it comes to networking. They don't know how to do it, but the idea is to just kind of jump in there, start talking about the fact that you're looking for work, start talking about the kind of thing that you're looking for, because that's how opportunities happen. That's how the world runs. LinkedIn, which we talked about briefly before, is also a great way to network. For those of you who are not familiar with it, LinkedIn is like Facebook for the professional space. So it's a great place to be talking about things that are in the big picture of your work life. If you're a student, you can talk about volunteer work. You might blog about some of the classes that you're taking. There are also groups, discussion groups that exist on LinkedIn, so you can join some of those and be active on those as well. And we'll talk more about LinkedIn in a bit. So LinkedIn, however wonderful it is, actually, let me mention really quickly before we move on. If you're interested in learning more about how to use LinkedIn, Cancer and Careers did a webinar earlier this year on building an effective LinkedIn profile that was run by one of our truly brilliant career coaches that we work with. So we have that archived on our website, and you can go and you can watch the video anytime, and some really great pointers about how you can maximize your use of LinkedIn. However, it does not replace the time-tested tools of job hunting, which very specifically are the resume and cover letter. So when writing an effective resume, you want to have a particular audience in mind. You want to make sure that you use language that's polished, that's easy to read, and that makes an impact, and summarizes your accomplishments succinctly. So for those of you who have a little bit more work experience, you don't need to laundry list every single thing you've ever done in your professional career. Just highlight the major accomplishments. Lengthwise, the rule of thumb is 1 page if you're entry level, 2 pages for those who are a little bit more seasoned. And you should use words that are targeted and future focused so that you're telling your employer that you're thinking about the next thing that's going to help you move forward. Also vitally important is the cover letter. And having just gone through a hiring process recently at Cancer and Careers, I can tell you that there is nothing that stands out more in a pile of cover letters than one that is generic. You want to make sure that you're tailoring your cover letter specifically for the job that you are applying for. And you want to avoid making it a rehashing of everything that's already listed in your resume. Instead, what you want to do is use your prose to draw connections between your experiences, your skills, and what it is that they're looking for in somebody who's going to fill the work position. A lot of people also ask us if they should include some discussion of their cancer experience in their cover letter, either because it was a positive and it helped them learn skills or build, they felt it was a character building thing, or as an explanation of some kind. And the response that we typically give is it's not the best place to do that. I want to emphasize again that cover letters and resumes are the tools that are going to open the door to get you into an interview. And so if it's absolutely essential for you to disclose as part of the hiring process, you know with 100% certainty that you want anybody that you're going to work for to know ahead of time that this is part of your story, you absolutely have the right to do that, but we recommend that you wait until you've met someone in person, at least. Because again, if you think about dating, there's only so much that you can know about somebody before you spend time with them. That first meeting, that first glass of wine is the game changer. That's when you know if there's potential for a second meeting. So again, sharing information on paper when you don't have a sense of what it's like to hang out with somebody is going to land in a particular way. Once you've actually had a conversation, that information is going to land differently. It's also the case that nobody shares everything about themselves in a job interview. Nobody has ever showed up to a job interview and said, I spend all day at work chewing gum and I blow bubbles and I pop them and it's really loud and it inevitably annoys the person that I'm sitting next to, right? In the same way, people who have gone through other medical experiences don't necessarily disclose. My best friend in the whole world has juvenile diabetes. She was diagnosed when she was 6 years old, and she's never told an employer that or a potential employer in an interview that she's a diabetic because it's not relevant to the conversation. What's relevant to the conversation is that she's an amazing teacher and she's great with kids and she's an asset to anyone who wants to hire her. So that's what she talks about. So keeping in mind that leaving out information is not a lie. It's just keeping the conversation tailored to what's relevant. We also hear from survivors who are concerned because they have a gap in their resume. And this might be a gap that occurred while they were going to school. Maybe it was between graduating and looking for work, or that they did take time away from a job, and so there's a window in there. And they're not sure how to handle it if the question gets asked in a job interview. So the good news is that in 2012, CareerBuilder, which is a job board website, did a study, and they talked to a bunch of hiring managers, and they found that since the economic downturn that happened in 2008, hiring managers are now a lot more used to seeing gaps on people's resumes than they used to for all kinds of reasons. So it's not a flashing neon sign that you went through an illness. And in fact, they also told CareerBuilder that very often they don't even ask about it, which means that it's entirely possible that even if you have a gap on your resume, it's not going to come up in conversation. However, it might. And if it does, it's best to be prepared with some thoughts as to how to answer the question. And so what we recommend in these circumstances is a technique that we call the swivel. It's a verbal pattern, and it involves acknowledging the question that was asked, inserting an "and" in there, and then swiveling the conversation back to an area where you feel comfortable talking. So a couple of examples on the slide in front of you for what that might look like. I see you have a gap on your resume. Can you tell me about that? Absolutely. I was dealing with a family issue that's now resolved, and I'm so excited by the prospect of building on my internships in marketing and PR to contribute to your communications team. In fact, I organized this tweet chat at my last internship. I'm really proud of it, and then you can go on to talk about the tweet chat. So essentially, the reason that this works is that most people will pick up the conversation from the point where it was left off. So if you grab the steering wheel on that and say, I hear what you asked, and I'm going to acknowledge that you asked that, and I'm going to talk about this other thing, which again is relevant to the interview. I'm going to tell you why I'm a good candidate. You can avoid having to go into any sort of detail and any sort of awkward moment about that gap. It can also be applied in all sorts of different circumstances. You know, if you have an experience of a friend asking how you're feeling, and they do that kind of, how are you feeling? And they, tip their head, and you know that they're actually asking, how's everything going with treatment, and blah, and you don't feel like talking about it. Well, feeling is a really broad word. How am I feeling? Actually, I'm feeling kind of hungry now that you mention it. You want to go grab a slice of pizza? So really, just useful life skill in general. When it comes to interviewing, your best bet is to practice, practice, practice. And we at Cancer and Careers, we have a mock interview toolkit on our website, which you can download. And it's also important, so you can practice and prep. It's also important to keep in mind that prospective employers are, they're thinking about how they can solve the problem. They're thinking about how they can find the best candidate for the job. So even if you walk in with concerns about, are they going to ask about my cancer? Are they going to ask about my gap? That's not what they're thinking about. They're really hoping that you're going to be the right person for the job so that they don't have to keep interviewing more candidates. Just as employers can Google you, you can also Google your employers, and you should. And this is a good practice, not just because it's going to help you to talk about the company and the position in an interview, but also because it gives you an opportunity to find out information about where you might be working. So things like whether there have been any discrimination lawsuits in the past or something that you might want to look into. If you think you might need to use the ADA, finding out the size of employer can be useful. So I encourage you to Google, I encourage you to dig around. If you networked your way into the job through somebody who's already working there, maybe talk to them about what it's like to work there. Very helpful for you to know who you're getting into bed with. The ultimate goal of a job search, of course, is to start a new job, and there's a major pro to this, which is it's an exciting opportunity to continue moving forward. It means your job search has been successful. But on the flip side, one of the cons of starting over is that you don't know much about the place. So you want to spend some time figuring out where you've landed, what the culture of the organization is, because that's going to be information that you might use down the line. Is it a place where people come in after their weekend and stand around the water cooler chatting about the things that they did because their coworkers are really like a second family? Or is it a place that's really corporate and everybody sits in their cubicle and they do their work and they don't really talk? It's a good idea to get a sense of all of that. Also the case that every organization has its dysfunctions, so knowing what the dysfunctions are there is going to be useful to just get a sense of how it is that you're going to fit in and how you're going to navigate those things. When it comes to talking about your cancer at work, the first thing that you may want to think about is whether you actually need to share the information. So for example, if you're still in treatment, if you have standing doctor's appointments that you need to go to, then you might need to disclose. And it's useful to sit down with your healthcare team, talk with them about information that may affect your work and treatment. Healthcare teams, when they're talking about side effects and with the realities of going through treatment, don't always bring work up in the conversation, so that's something that you can do. Also think about whether or not you're a sharer. Are you going to be comfortable talking about this, or is it going to be important for you to share this work because you're going to be spending share this information because you're going to be spending so much time with all of these people, and it would be very uncomfortable for you to not be able to talk about it with them? Or are you more private and you prefer to keep these things to yourself? Because that's all going to influence how you have the conversation. This is also where understanding the company culture comes into play. If it's a sharing environment, then you may just share whatever you want to share, as much information as you feel comfortable with. If it's more buttoned up, you might decide that you don't really want to share, or you only want to share if it becomes necessary, and then as little as information as possible. I also want to bring up really quickly that if you are going to be having a conversation about this circumstance with a manager, keep in mind that just because someone is a boss, it doesn't mean that they've ever had a conversation with an employee about how to navigate and manage these things. So at Cancer and Careers, we have an online toolkit called the Manager's Toolkit, which can be downloaded, and it can be really useful in helping you structure a conversation with any managers. When it comes to talking to coworkers, it's often about filling in the gaps, particularly if you're experiencing physical side effects that are affecting your appearance, so that they don't start to speculate about what's going on with you. And in general, it's smart to think about your physical presence in the workplace as well. So what ongoing side effects do you have? How are those going to be navigated? How can your work life become easier if you're living with that reality? And by far and away, the most common side effect that we get asked about at Cancer and Careers is chemo brain. And how do you maintain focus while you have chemo brain? Well, the thing that we like to tell everybody is that your first best approach is to really let go of multitasking, because as this slide shows, almost nobody is good at it. And again, this has nothing to do with health history. This has nothing to do with age or anything else that's personal. This just has to do with being a human. And the fact that the human brain can really only process a limited amount of information at a time. And specifically, it works best when it's focusing on one thing at a time. So the best trick is just to simplify. Get clutter out of your workstation. Clutter can create distractions. Turn off email notifications, hide your cell phone, and create a prioritized to-do list and attack one thing at a time. Also a good idea to maintain a single notebook where you write down everything. We say the single notebook because you don't want to have a home notebook and a work notebook and find yourself walking into a meeting with your grocery list. That can be a little bit awkward. And write things down. Write down things that you want to remember. If you're going to be presenting at a meeting, obviously, you want to maybe think through some of the things that you're going to say. But also, if you're planning for a phone call, having a script for yourself so that you hit all the major points, especially if you're in sales. These can all be really useful practices to help you maintain focus.
So finally, another reason that you may want to think about disclosing in the workplace is because disclosing might give you access to some legal benefits, as we've talked about earlier. And as promised, we've gotten to the reasonable accommodation section. And so the legal definition of a reasonable accommodation is any change in the work environment or in the way that things are customarily done that enables an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. And really, it's critical to think of these reasonable accommodations as tools. And they're tools that can make working through treatment or even returning back to work if you're still dealing with some side effects much, much easier. And the easiest way for us to explain the concept of reasonable accommodations is to go through some examples.
So the first type of accommodation that you might ask for is about modifying the workspace, meaning the actual environment while you're doing your work. And this could mean asking the company to buy a printer that you keep at your workstation so that you don't have to get up and walk across the office 50 times a day because your job involves printing out a lot of things and the printer that you're hooked up to is really far away. However, our favorite example of modifying workspace is a story about a social worker that we worked with a few years back. And she was going through treatment, and she found herself feeling nauseous during the day when she was at work. That's not particularly strange in and of itself. A lot of people feel nauseous when they're going through cancer treatments. However, what was strange is that she wasn't feeling nauseous when she was at home in the evenings, and she also was not feeling nauseous during the same hours on the weekend when she was at home. So we did a little bit of digging around and discovered that her office was located next to the cafeteria. And so the smells of the food cooking were wafting through the door every day, and they were making her feel ill at her desk. So for her, a reasonable accommodation was about switching offices with somebody who was further away from the cafeteria. And it didn't make working through treatment a breeze for her, but it did mean that she wasn't feeling nauseous anymore, and so she could do her job better. So there's no one-size-fits-all accommodation. It's really about peeling back the layers of what's going on to figure out where the problem sits and then how you can address that problem. Second type of accommodation is modifying schedule. And again, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, but here are some examples to get you thinking. So can you work from home full or part-time? Now, obviously, a bus driver is not going to be able to telecommute, but it's becoming really, really common for people to work from home these days. And so finding out whether it's possible for you to do this part-time or full-time, that can eliminate a commute, let you lie down, really useful approach. Also thinking about whether you can redistribute your hours. So we call that a flexible schedule. So it might be that if you usually work 9 to 5, you would switch that to working 7 to 3. Same number of hours in a day, but just distributed differently because you can focus better in the morning right after you wake up, and so you'll do better work during that time. If your job includes allocated breaks, it's usually shift work that does. Thinking about whether it's possible for you to take additional breaks. So maybe instead of 2 45-minute breaks, you distribute them into multiple 15-minute breaks so that you have a little bit more time to rest sporadically throughout the day. The trick is to be both logical and creative when you present solutions to your employer, and it's a collaborative process, so you want to work with them to see how they can support you while also making suggestions for what's going to work for you.
And then sort of the third set of reasonable accommodations is everything else. So maybe it's about using technology. So if you're one of those people that's having a hard time focusing and remembering things, and going into meetings is anxiety producing with your boss because you're so focused on writing everything down as opposed to participating in the meeting, maybe taking in a tape recorder so that you have that security blanket of the tape recorder to get you through. It could be about a change in policy. So maybe if you are a cashier at a supermarket and they say no stools at your checkout stand, but you're dealing with fatigue, policy change just for you, you're allowed a stool at the checkout stand. It could also be relevant if your job says you're not permitted to wear any hats or head coverings, but because of your treatment, wearing a hat or a scarf or a beanie is really important to you. A policy change and allowing you to wear that hat is a reasonable accommodation. It could be about shifting responsibilities. So if you remember way back when, the beginning of the hour, before your eyes all started to gloss over, we talked about being a qualified individual, and that was about being able to do the essential functions of the job. Well, most of us in our daily lives, in our workplace at least, are not just asked to do the essential functions. So if you think about maybe a receptionist, an essential functions of his job might be to answer the phone, open the mail, and greet people when they walk in. But because the water cooler is next to his desk, he also gets asked to change that as well. Due to his treatment, that's challenging now. So maybe that responsibility can be shifted to somebody else because it's really not an essential function of his job. And then what we call the accommodation of last resort is changing jobs. And the reason we say this is because it only works if there's a vacant position and you're qualified for that position. So employers are not required to create a new position for you as an accommodation. So if you are maybe an ER nurse and due to your treatment, you're immunocompromised, being in a germ-ridden ER where you have no idea what's going to walk through the door, probably not the best idea. So maybe you can shift to an administrative position that's open that you're qualified for. But there are some specifics and some tips to get through all of this. And as Rachel alluded to, the accommodations have to be reasonable. So if you're a bus driver, telecommuting, probably not reasonable. If you're the only accountant in a firm and it's, April 14th, maybe taking April 14th off is not going to be reasonable. Employers are required to provide reasonable accommodations unless they can show that it's an undue hardship. And that's a very high burden for employers to meet. But just because they have to provide an accommodation, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the accommodation that you want as your number one accommodation. When you ask for these accommodations, you do not have to invoke the ADA. You don't have to use the words reasonable accommodation. But as Rachel mentioned, a lot of supervisors, managers, even HR professionals, human resource professionals, are not always trained to be that position or trained in the law. So you might think, well, of course I'm asking for a reasonable accommodation. They should know what I'm asking for, even if I don't use the words. It can be to your benefit to spell it out specifically and say the words reasonable accommodation, just to kind of trigger in their minds, I'm not asking for a favor, I'm asking for a right that I'm entitled to. When you ask, just like everything with the job search process, it can be really useful to go in prepared. Practice what you're going to say, have some ideas for reasonable accommodations in your back pocket. And if you're sitting there thinking, well, I have no idea what might be an accommodation, there is a tool through the Department of Labor called the Job Accommodation Network, or JAN. And its sole purpose is to help both employers and employees come up with good, reasonable accommodations. So there's a searchable online database that you can use, and you don't have to put in any personal information to use this database, but you can go in and put your job type and whatever side effect situation you're dealing with, and it will pop out other reasonable accommodations people have used in the past. So maybe that's something that you can just kind of copy and say, oh, that's a good idea, or it might just spur some ideas for other reasonable accommodations. When you ask, you don't have to ask your HR rep, you don't have to ask your supervisor, but it can be useful to look in that employee manual or policy and procedures document to see if they've already set out a process for asking for these accommodations. And by the way, this conversation is also relevant in the employment, in the education arena as well. There's lots of Office of Disabilities where you can go in and ask for accommodations, and all of these things we're talking about are relevant. When you ask for an accommodation, it is supposed to be kept confidential. So that means that your boss can't go into the staff meeting and say, we all have to rally around Sue because she's going to be out every Friday for the next couple weeks. However, if you're talking to, let's say, your HR rep, and you think it's going to be confidential, keep in mind that some other people in the company or office might need to know this information. For example, if you're going to start telecommuting, it's probably reasonable that your direct supervisor is going to know that you're getting this accommodation. So yes, it's supposed to be kept confidential, but that doesn't necessarily mean only that person will get that information. And then finally, as Rachel alluded to, this is a process. So when you go in and talk to your supervisor, your HR department, and you say, I'd like to telecommunicate as a reasonable accommodation, they can't just say no. It has to be, well, telecommuting's not going to work for us, but what about X? And there has to be a back and forth between the two people, and that's what we refer to as the interactive process. Finally, the last sort of piece we're going to talk about today is caregivers. Legally, under the ADA, caregivers are not entitled to reasonable accommodations. Because if you remember, you have to currently have the disability in order to be eligible under the ADA. That being said, the only definite no is the question not asked. So it cannot hurt to ask an employer for a reasonable accommodation. Most employers want to keep their employees. It's useful for all sorts of reasons. So if you're a caregiver and you're thinking, wow, this would be really useful for me, I recommend thinking about asking for it and going through the same process, but just knowing that the employer does have the option to say no. And because we've covered a ton of information in a short period of time, we just wanted to give you some additional resources where you can get more of this information in depth. So do you want to talk about?
Sure. So this is some information about upcoming events that Cancer and Careers is hosting. Our West Coast Conference is happening this year, and we do also have a job search webinar that's coming up in December. Some information about our 2016 conferences there. If you're interested in attending our national conference, we do offer travel scholarships. So in January, if you want to check out our website, there'll be information about how to apply. These are some links to webinars that we've done in the past. I mentioned the LinkedIn webinar. It's archived on our website, so feel free to take a look. These are some of the other topics we've covered.
And then, as I mentioned, Triage has some additional resources. They're listed here. You can find them all on our website. We have 2 upcoming webinars that might be relevant to you. One is about picking a health insurance policy. So this is, even if you have an employer-sponsored policy and maybe you have 2 different options, this would be relevant. If you're trying to buy health insurance in the marketplace, this would be relevant. We just kind of talk about things to look for. And then we're also doing a webinar in December on disability insurance. So kind of the nuts and bolts of disability insurance. And then we've also given you some third-party resources, so the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, JAN, legal assistance. And then finally, here's our contact information. So that's it. Thank you.